Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, confusion reigned as responders mustered to the wrong location for the chlorine spill, with many not having respiratory protection. We now continue with Part 1, Chapter 6, Gassed. Epigraph. We looked back toward Alberton, and you could see a cloud over the whole town. Alberton Fireman James Claxton. Evacuation west of Petty Creek. The Alberton volunteers returned from Petty Creek to find gas had engulfed their town. Responders included Fire Chief Tim Ishler, Assistant Chief James Claxton, Terry Fairbanks, Doug Lausch, and Thor Augustine. They had a tiny budget and dubious equipment. Claxton missed the false start to Petty Creek, sleeping through his pager until someone roused him. He believed the gas had encumbered him. The trailer really smelled bad of chlorine, he said. The volunteers assembled in the old fire hall in the center of town. The crew prided itself on fast response, but the faulty dispatch had wasted valuable time. Ishler, 37, assigned crew to 3 vehicles, directing Fairbanks to stay at the hall and operate the emergency siren. Fairbanks first had to evacuate her 2 children, who got a ride from a neighbor. Around 5 a.m., 32-year-old Fairbanks began cranking the loud manual siren until she got blisters. Residents kept opening the door to ask her what to do, letting gas in, and she didn't have a functioning SCBA. We only had 4 SCBAs at the time, Ishler said. Hand-me-downs, 1 unit malfunctioned, Fairbanks. I grabbed this old chlorine chemical canister gas mask and I put that on, Ishler said. That seemed to make it worse. Ishler canvassed east in Alberton and then came back to pick up Fairbanks and continue rounds. Most people heeded the siren and left fairly quickly, he thought. But Fairbanks described the evacuation as mass confusion. Ishler said visibility was only 2 or 3 blocks with patchy breaks. The gas gave a very acrid, bitter taste, he said. Burning, you could feel your airways closing up. I really did think I was going to die. Abandoning the useless gas mask, he held his hood over his face. Through watering and burning eyes, he developed tunnel vision. Claxton and Lausch evacuated central to West Alberton, mostly with their loudspeaker and sirens, and then drove on to Plateau Road, where they went house to house. Claxton recalled 2 chlorine clouds prior to reaching Plateau, kind of low to the ground, he said, about level with the cab. At Plateau, he didn't understand that they were close to the wreck, which he still thought to be near Petty Creek. As they ran low on air, they decided against leaving the cab to get a spare tank in the back, because we would be getting right dead in the middle of it, Claxton said. Instead, they took off their masks to conserve air, and whenever our breathing was getting bad, we'd just take a hit off them, just try to keep us going, he said. For a while, Claxton couldn't use the radio. I lost my breath. I couldn't speak. When they reached a spot of fresher air, they recovered some and continued evacuating Plateau Road. From the Plateau vantage, in the dusk, Claxton recalled, we looked back toward Alberton and you could see a cloud over the whole town at that point. That's when we realized how bad it was. After Plateau, they evacuated North Frontage Road across I-90 and up West Mountain Creek Road, and then re-entered the fog on the final run through Alberton. Ishler had 2 reinforcements. Patrick and Linda Walsh were 12-year veterans of the Frenchtown Volunteer Fire Department, a married couple who lived up 9 Mile Road. They got the call to muster to Station 5, expecting to get the appropriate gear and equipment, including SCBA for the site, Patrick recalled. While en route, the Walshes were ordered by Scott Waldron to directly help evacuate Alberton. Alberton had no SCBAs to spare. The rescue truck that first staged at Station 5, a unit from Frenchtown Station 1, had plentiful SCBAs and could recharge oxygen tanks. Engines 32 and 36, used at the roadblocks near 9 Mile, also had SCBAs. Waldron said all of our equipment had SCBAs on them. But it wasn't clear who, if anyone, used Frenchtown SCBAs besides Manson and Clay Ishler. Not any responder in Alberton, not the deputies. The Walshes went door to door without respiratory protection, as fast as possible. We didn't know how long we would be able to function, Patrick recalled. Frenchtown volunteer firefighter Pam Roberts said of 35-year-old Linda Walsh, she didn't want to do it, and she was ordered to go in and evacuate those people, and she knew that they didn't have the correct gear. She was really upset about the danger, I think, that the volunteers were put into. As the evacuation progressed, Ishler doubted its purpose. The majority of everybody probably would have fared okay if everybody would have just stayed inside. Ishler's opinion was based on questionable assumptions, that houses could be airtight and that gas hadn't entered through open windows. Still, to evacuate safely, residents needed an airtight car and to hold their breath while getting to it. Fairbanks described the smell as like sticking your nose in a bottle of bleach. It was very intense, she said. The scene reminded her of the John Carpenter movie The Fog. The chlorine gas was probably knee-deep, she said, a palish-greenish color, and it was eerie, it was spooky, it was terrifying. You could actually see it creeping down the roads. When the gas first arrived, she said, it was patchy, but by the time we left, it was just like going through a fog bank. You would cut through with the trucks and it would just fill in. It would patch up more going up the mountainside, but the valley itself, it was just like a solid fog, except it was this greenish stench. When Ishler received final orders from Chief Waldron to pull out, oxygen tanks were empty and exposure for the volunteers was becoming severe. Claxton and Lausch were reportedly the last ones out, sometime before 7 a.m. The Walshes had struggled. After about 45 to 90 minutes of direct exposure, our breathing was becoming more and more labored, Patrick recalled. We both started to vomit and did so with increasing frequency. My eyes were watering heavily and burning. As he drove through the town, Walsh could barely see more than a few feet and had a couple narrow collision misses. Soon, the Walshes could barely talk loud enough to warn residents. They had burning lungs and difficulty breathing. As Patrick verged on fainting, they decided to evacuate themselves, while still helping others on their way out. But when Linda began to struggle to breathe, they skipped some houses and went straight to the Frenchtown High School Evacuation Center. The Alberton volunteers escaped to the 9-mile exit staging area and were ambulanced to Missoula. Alan and Cynthia Matthews of Alberton arrived at St. Patrick's Hospital parking lot at the same time as an Alberton fireman. He got out and just stumbled to his knees, Cynthia said. We helped him into the emergency room. There was no decontamination measures, Ishler said of the 9-mile forward command site. They had the little pools and the wash down units set up, but I don't remember seeing anybody get washed down through the whole thing. Normally, when a contaminated responder, especially under the influence of a chemical, showed up at decon, he would be attended to. Ishler was not decontaminated at the St. Patrick Hospital emergency room either, where he received an aerosol nebulizer treatment, chest x-ray, and was released. I didn't clean up until I took a shower in the motel, he said. Ishler's acute symptoms included congestion, severe coughing, vomiting, sore eyes, and blurred vision. Decontamination in a hazmat situation was basic first aid. For chlorine, this entailed irrigating the eyes for at least 15 minutes, immediately flushing exposed skin with copious water, removing all contaminated clothing, and bathing with soap and water. Fairbanks confirmed that the crews at the 9-mile staging and at St. Patrick's Hospital never did go through a decontamination. The ambulance itself smelled so bad of chlorine, she said. I went to the ER in full turnouts. I left my coat in the ambulance because it stunk so bad. The hospital never told her to change clothes and wash, nor did they give her a gown. She took her own measures because it was basic EMS training, she said. I think in all honesty that the medical centers were unprepared. When Fairbanks arrived at the ER with a severe migraine and difficulty breathing, they put on an O2 meter to take my oxygen level, gave me a shot of Demerol, and sent me home. I was never given chest x-rays. I was given no neurological testing. Fairbanks had a prehistory of migraines, though none in 5 years. Now she acutely suffered a severe migraine that induced vomiting and had chemical burns on her eyes and difficulty breathing. Normally, lung function tests were recommended following chlorine exposure with respiratory symptoms. With all the people coming in the ER, Fairbanks understood there was triage, yet I felt like I got pushed out the door, she said. Claxton confirmed a lack of decontamination anywhere at any time. At St. Patrick's ER, he said, they never took our clothes. Everybody else in the ER room was getting contaminated. Poorly protected and poorly supported, the Alberton responders risked their health and lives to evacuate their townsfolk and neighbors. Alberton awoke to crisis. Lucinda Hodges had cracked some windows for fresh air, which she regretted in the dead of night. Smoky Joe, her black lab, was barking. Heavy with sleep, Hodges ignored Joey until maybe half an hour later, a keening siren jolted her solidly conscious. She and her family slept in their old Merc home opposite the Alberton Fire Hall on Railroad Avenue in upstairs front bedrooms. Looking out, she saw lights flashing and fire trucks and thought the Sidetrack Cafe was burning. Hurrying down, she opened the front door to find Howard Hogan standing on the sidewalk. Hodges panicked. Where was the air? "It's a chlorine spill. Get the hell out of Alberton," Hogan yelled. "Go to Frenchtown." The old veteran was an honorary volunteer on the Alberton Fire Department. In the dark, some thing rolled across the ground heading east, fog-like, at least as high as the streetlights, Hodges said. It was like oven cleaner, this awful acrid burning. It never smelled like bleach to me, just horrible fumes, and Howard had no respirator. Back inside, husband Mark Hansen told Lucinda to calm down because he couldn't smell anything in the house. "No," she said, "we got to get out now." Hodges remembered well the deadly 1978 Youngstown, Florida derailment and chlorine spill. She was only 30 miles away at the time. "Those kids who died," she recalled later, "I remember their funerals. I remember the whole thing, and I kept thinking, this is just like Youngstown. This is life or death." Other people, I couldn't believe it. Later, they say they were blow-drying their hair and getting their curlers. Hodges ran upstairs, yelling at her two boys, "Get up! Emergency! We're leaving!" She hurried outside to start her van and then ran back to get Jesse, the youngest. She covered Jesse in 2 blankets and carried him to the van, and when she returned to get 10-year-old Trask, Hansen was dressing. "I'll follow you in my car," he said. "I want to check on Dan." Hansen's 13-year-old son from a previous marriage was visiting, but stayed that night with friends. Hodges grabbed Joey. He'd been trying to warn them, joined the kids in the van, and left. She had nothing but a coat on over her pajamas. No shoes, glasses, wallet, nothing. On Adams Street, going east toward the Petty Creek Interstate entrance, her van stalled, and she knew it was the gas, remembering how Florida cars wouldn't run. Her windows and vents were closed, and her kids bundled up, but gas seeped in. Her damn van conked out again, even as she accelerated. In Florida, people had panicked and run from dead vehicles until they too died. The third and last time it quit was almost 2 miles from home, at the entrance to I-90 where a deputy's truck blocked the road up Petty Creek. Hodges was shocked to see the man wore no protection and had the windows down in the truck, with a thick cloud rolling by even here. Hansen then pulled up. He hadn't looked for Dan, he said. Once outside, he realized how bad this shit was. They both took off. Finally, the cloud thinned at the top of the 9-mile hill 5 miles further east, where they found their first taste of fresh, blessed air. Hodges pulled over and told Hansen she was going to Missoula and her mother's trailer house. Hansen would head to Frenchtown to see if he could help evacuees. As Hodges drove by Frenchtown, she saw but 2 cars at the high school, the unofficial evacuee center, and realized she had been one of the first to get out. When Hodges got to her mother's trailer in northwest Missoula, Catherine opened the door and said, "What is that smell?" referring to the stench emanating from her daughter and grandchildren. Upset, Hodges called a 1-800 number for the Poison Control Center in Denver. They already knew about the derailment. "I'm a little short of breath," she said. "My throat burns, but everyone else seems okay." Poison Control told Hodges to take off all their clothes, put them in plastic bags, get rid of them, and shower. "If you're coughing at all or don't feel you're breathing properly, go to the hospital," they told her. They all stripped and took baths. "When I took my coat off, you could see crystals," Hodges said, "like salt crystals all over it." Her mother bagged their clothes and put them on the porch. "I went to the hospital as soon as I was dressed. I told my mom I don't feel right. Her kids felt okay and stayed behind." When Hodges got to St. Patrick's Hospital in downtown Missoula, the ER didn't seem that crazy yet. "I told the staff that I had been in the derailment and I didn't feel well. Could they check me out?" And this guy, I don't know if he was a doctor or nurse, he said, "Well, can you breathe?" And I said, "Yes." And he says, "Well, I suggest you go outside and do that." He says, "There's nothing we can do for you." And that was it. I went back outside. Though she'd already decontaminated, it struck her that he hadn't even told her to change clothes or bathe. I felt at loose ends. You feel something should happen after that. You wanted to talk to other people, know how they were. Having flown the coop, Hodges landed in limbo. At least one family remained behind because of misinformation about the spill. Eleanor and Norman Brovold lived in the east end of Alberton. Eleanor recalled, after the siren sounded, 911 said there was a chlorine spill at Petty Creek. This was around 5 a.m. So we thought, we're not going to go east, we'll go west and go to our son's house. Well, my goodness, it was several miles away from Petty Creek. As a result, the Brovolds evacuated toward the spill site. As she left, Eleanor recalled, it just looked rather foggy out. It smelled like bleach. Eleanor felt okay, but Norman couldn't breathe, and it was hard on him, she said. Because of the confusion at 911, the Brovolds never left the exclusion zone, evacuating up West Mountain Creek directly north of the hot zone. Eleanor's son lived over 3 miles up the drainage, and she felt safe. However, the Simmons family, who lived near the mouth of West Mountain Creek, reported a heavy gas cloud. Among the earliest to leave, Fran Hayes got a call to evacuate from a friend on the Frenchtown Rural Fire Department around 4:30 a.m. Hayes didn't yet see an obvious gas fog, but the air looked misty, she said. The smell was overpowering and not like bleach, more like fertilizer or weeding spray, she said, that burned her and her children's eyes and made them cough as they fled. While many people reported smelling only chlorine, others reported similar non-chlorine smells. Lois Johnson of Alberton said, we went out to get into the car and a big white cloud just come right down over the top of us in our car. And of course, we inhaled that. There was something more than chlorine in that smell. I know that. My husband said it smelled like pesticide to him. As Tom and Wilma Wheeler evacuated, the rolling gas fog was about 6 to 10 feet high and patchy. Wilma said, it smelled like fertilizer to me, not chlorine. Tom recalled a combination of chlorine and hardware store fertilizing stuff. Despite his asthma, Tom held up okay, but Wilma had great difficulty breathing and thought she would die. Sandy Halbert said, it wasn't chlorine. To me it was just a chemical smell, almost like a weed and feed. Alan Matthews described this horrible odor of chlorine and kind of a pesticide mix. Kathy Finneman recalled, when we opened the door it was so strong we could not breathe. The gas was like weed and feed, is what it smelled like. Very strong, and the cloud was a gray color. At the bottom of her driveway, Finneman said, it was so thick I couldn't see the garbage cans about 100 feet away. I had to turn my car lights on when I got down there. No one, including the ER, mentioned decontamination. The pets should have been washed, she said. The clothes should have been washed. No one said a word. Even at the very first meeting with MRL, nobody said anything. So we slept in those pajamas for 3 days before I got home to get other clothes. Finneman's car was also contaminated. No one said a word to us about cleaning our car. Randy and Dolores Augustine had a young daughter and son Thor, a member of the Alberton Volunteer Fire Department. When Thor got paged, Dolores initially accompanied him, but asthmatic, she returned home and told Randy they needed to evacuate. I didn't realize at the time she thought she was the walking dead, Randy recalled. She didn't think she'd live. Randy helped rouse next-door neighbors, including Howard Hogan, an elderly Army vet hard of hearing. Waking him was tricky, since Hogan slept with a shotgun next to his bed. Augustine formulated a plan as he ran over and entered Hogan's unlocked back door. I was at his bedroom, and I said, Hogan, attention! He got up and he was saluting in his skivvies. He hadn't reached for his shotgun. So I told him we had to evacuate the town. But in running back and forth, Augustine said, I had taken in a lot of chlorine and I was falling down. I'd fall down and have to pick myself up off the grass. That happened 3 times. Augustine thought he was temporarily blacking out. From this and other accounts, it seemed possible that some people might have succumbed to the gas that morning, if not for the help of neighbors. Augustine recalled a gas fog, but also rain-wet grass that burned like acid when he fell. Within 12 hours, I had open blisters from my knees down that were just bleeding. He only smelled chlorine that morning. Coughing severely, the Augustines fled to Frenchtown High School, where Dolores passed out, her inhalers failing to aid her. An ambulance crew revived her. Later, the Augustines heard that Thor had gotten out after helping evacuate Alberton. Randy was immediately concerned about his family's clothes, which he felt were saturated with HCl. Short on money, Augustine went to MRL's offices later in the day to complain that their clothes were burning them, and he wanted MRL to pay for new ones. As he left MRL with a check for Walmart, another family arrived with the same complaint. The public perception was that MRL offered clothes vouchers to J.C. Penney's beginning the second day, in recognition that many people evacuated with few possessions, and that the evacuation would be prolonged. Augustine's statement suggested that MRL, if not health officials, were also aware that people had complaints about contaminated clothes, though evacuees were never officially advised to shower and change clothes. Still having problems breathing, Dolores went to the emergency room the second day. Randy felt that her inhalers, now ineffective, had become themselves an exposure trigger because the propellant in the inhalers was chlorine-based, he said. This was true at the time. Like Hodges, the Griffin family's truck stalled a few times in the gas fog. Deborah Griffin marveled. There were people stopped in the street, side by side in their vehicles, the windows down, talking like it was no big deal. People walking in the streets. I mean, it was really weird. The Griffins went to the Frenchtown Evacuation Center, where no one offered decontamination. By evening, Deborah and husband Dana were having really bad headaches. The next morning, Deborah felt severe joint and muscle pain, and the whole family felt like they had the flu. Dana was later diagnosed with chemically burned eyes. Hearing sirens, Ben Cloud walked outside and found a really burning type of smell that nearly dropped me to my knee, he said. Cloud evacuated his family in their night clothes. His wife Jolene had a history of asthma. She tried not to breathe, but she couldn't do it, Ben said. It didn't take much to get her asthma full-blown right away. Jolene immediately took a rescue inhaler. Patty Freese couldn't gauge the mist height, but it was over her roof. It kind of went in waves, she said. It looked like a big cloud. My neighbors that live up above me, about 50 feet higher, they said they could look down and see our house engulfed in that green mist, but it never got up to their house at the time of evacuation. The Freeses evacuated around 5:30 a.m., Patty said. I couldn't breathe until we got past Frenchtown. The tears were just running down my face. They went straight to Freese's daughter's home in Missoula and listened to the radio for news. What I was really upset about, there was no word for us to wash this off of our skin, and all day we sat with that acid on our skin. Mike Graff recalled, by the time we got to the highway, you literally could not see the end of the hood of your car. It took us 30 minutes to go 7 miles on the interstate. That's how thick the fog was. Such descriptions matched what the earlier I-90 drivers encountered across from the spill site. Despite living close to the spill site, not everyone on Plateau Road evacuated before responders finally arrived. Several residents slept through the gas for up to hours, some waking only after friends called or neighbors roused them. The gas came in through open windows, and residents described more of a herbicide smell. Real strong, though, just like an airplane had sprayed you, one said. Or a mix of things, including chlorine. The cloud was very thick outside, even after 6 a.m. While driving off, one resident had to follow a fence because he couldn't see the road with the headlights, he said. Symptoms included burning sensations and difficulty breathing. One asthmatic said, I was just choking. I couldn't breathe at all. Another Plateau resident found neighbors acting odd and confused. They were sleeping with their window open, and he said that they had just put flea collars on the dogs, and he thought that's what that smell was. He threw the dogs out, opened the window, and went back to bed. While going for treatment for an acute cough, eventually at both St. Patrick's and Community ER, one Plateau Road evacuee felt distrustful because the doctor said that MRL had provided a written protocol for chlorine symptoms and treatment that implied the exposure was not serious. The resident said MRL gave the doctors a piece of paper with the symptoms on it. If they're coughing, give them codeine. If they have sore skin, tell them that it will go away, and wash their sore skin. This resident's severe sinus infection during the 17-day evacuation period was dismissed at St. Patrick's Hospital as a spring cold. Evacuation, Petty Creek to 9 Mile. One of the first evacuations east of Petty Creek was the command post at Station 5. At 5 a.m., Waldron advised he was moving, having underestimated the advance of the gas cloud. He found the smell very strong, he said. It didn't make sense to have a command post in an area being evacuated from a gas cloud, and Ponderosa Acres was also a trap without an east escape route. By 5:15 a.m., Waldron was setting up command at the county shopyard near the 9 Mile exit of I-90, 5 miles east of Petty Creek on 9 Mile Hill. Waldron had planned to use Unit 818 to help with evacuations, but we couldn't, he said. Instead, he moved the big rig with him to 9 Mile exit, taking with it 2 MIN, SCBAs, and a system for filling oxygen bottles. leaving the SCBA train crew unused in helping with evacuations. While Waldron scrambled to relocate command, he called for the page of all Frenchtown volunteers to Station 1 in Frenchtown. Only the west side of the district had been paged at first. Waldron: well, it was obvious that this was going to be a big incident. It was going to be long-term, and we needed all the help we could get. We didn't know how far this cloud was going to travel. We didn't know if we'd have to evacuate Frenchtown. So I was preloading the system with as much as I could get. Waldron said perhaps 30 volunteers could have responded from the 5 Frenchtown rural stations. Despite his page, Waldron did not add responders to the ongoing evacuations, and had even pulled out Unit 818. He apparently thought he had enough help to evacuate and sufficient protection for responders. The deputies began evacuating east of Petty Creek. While Waldron described the gas as very strong, making it untenable to stay at Station 5, the deputies had no SCBA. Deputy Willis Hintz would take Ponderosa Acres, while Deputy Roy Van Wormer went up Southside Road. Hintz also sent Mineral County Deputy Jeff Wilson up Petty Creek for a couple of miles to notify people. Van Wormer noted, "I asked Sergeant Hintz if every house had to be evacuated, and he advised that for the sake of time, if they are on the very top of the hill, to move on to the lower, more at-risk houses, a sort of evacuation triage. Some short lanes branched up Cinderella Mountain off of Southside. I did not make contact with the homeowner or go to the house if another Southside resident advised me that he had already informed that person of the situation," Van Wormer said. When Van Wormer first smelled chlorine, he told Hintz it was irritating, but didn't burn. Later, he told Hintz, "I'd say it's several parts per million if I use your rule of thumb, because it is pretty irritating." Hintz said this rule of thumb, absent a monitor, came from emergency training. "If it's burning your nose and eyes, it's time to get the hell out," he said. "Go uphill and get the hell out of the way." Reliance on odor detection was a poor strategy. Repeated exposure to chlorine could lead to olfactory fatigue and some tolerance to the irritating but still damaging effects. Hintz wanted residents on Southside to evacuate east to avoid coming west toward the gas cloud to reach I-90, but Southside was unpaved a few miles past the Riverview Ranch, and Van Wormer advised that in places the road was barely passable. Between road design and conditions, much of the Alberton area was dead ends and axle traps. As Deputy Joe McNeil responded, Hintz had him stop by Stone Container and pick up an SCBA. One was better than nothing for the deputies. The other deputies were ahead of McNeil, and I'm letting them know on the radio that this is nothing you just drive into, McNeil recalled. McNeil formerly worked at the Frenchtown pulp mill. I had been chlorinated many times when I was working at the mill, and so I was well aware of what it can do to you. The SCBA was for himself. I figured I was going out towards the spill, he said. But McNeil got sidetracked, along with his SCBA, when he helped set up the Frenchtown evac center. No one thought to shuttle the unit, and yet another SCBA went unused. At about 5:30 a.m., Hintz reported to Sheriff Doug Chase a real strong smell at Petty Creek, and he headed for higher ground. In less than 90 minutes, the chlorine level 4 miles from the spill had become intolerable. John and Carol Greenwood lived about a mile up Petty Creek Road. When Deputy Wilson banged on their door at 5:10 a.m., Carol recalled an intense chemical smell. "I couldn't say chlorine," she said. "It had kind of a herbicide, perhaps an insecticide smell to it," John recalled. "It was definitely something with the chlorine." They saw no gas cloud in the dark. The Greenwoods' account was notable in that the gas reached them 4 miles east and another mile south, upstream in this narrow drainage. Carol said canyon winds varied and could be very strange. Normally, at night, a draft came down the creek. Because the pass to the south was a quagmire, the deputies sent the Greenwoods north to I-90. "When we got down just about to the river," John said, "we come into something that looked like a light fog, and that's where we really got hit. It was really vicious there." Carol said they went to the ER, coughing really bad, the eyes burning, real nauseous. No one decontaminated them. Larry and Avis Mickelson lived on the bench just above Southside Road, east of Petty Creek. Larry worked for the Montana Highway Department and was already awake around 5:30 a.m. as sirens wailed in the distance. Soon a deputy knocked and practically let himself in to inform the Mickelsons about the evacuation. Larry smelled a very strong chlorine smell outside. In the yard light, he said, you could see the mist in the air moving east. Mickelson later believed it would have been best not to have evacuated because there was never any smell inside the house, he said. We went through the worst part of it going to Frenchtown. It got so strong in the car that everybody was beginning to have a problem breathing, even with the windows and ventilation closed. Mickelson felt very sick for 3 or 4 days, with nausea, diarrhea, and some difficulty breathing. Jay Stiles and family lived on Southside Road about 1 mile east of Petty Creek. When Jay was woken around 6 a.m. by a deputy, the cloud had already arrived. It looked like the light was up above me because there was so much gas in the air. It was like a fog, Stiles said. Outside, the smell was strong. Your eyes were watering, sinuses, your throat, you could feel it burning. It was real scary. You felt like you were choking. As Stiles drove them to Petty Creek, a foggy mist clouded the windshield. I made a big mistake by turning on the defrost and just flooded the cab with more gases, he said. As daylight came on, we got on the interstate and drove through a cloud of chlorine that got thicker and thicker. By Stiles' observation, the gas pooled in pockets. In the Southside Ponderosa Acres area, the river carved a droopy bend against the mountain, in which air stagnated like a river eddy. You could see it from the interstate, he said. It just hung right here in this area. And when we were evacuated, we hit other pockets on the other side. The gas was spreading, but not uniformly. The gas cloud ran ahead of evacuations, and many people east of Petty Creek discovered the emergency on their own. Jamie and Bill Becker lived on Alberton Lane, a private spur off Southside that wound a short way up Cinderella Mountain's northeast flank. Jamie Becker found little information on the radio. This didn't seem to be a crisis. The air was very, very heavy, she recalled. It smelled more like herbicides or fertilizer. Not contacted by a deputy, apparently because they were higher up the mountain, the Beckers were evacuated by phone at 6:30 a.m. As they passed their shop building 150 yards down the road, but uphill, there was more of a chlorine smell, Jamie said. That morning, Jamie's face turned red and tears ran down her cheeks. She already was sensitive to air pollution. Her husband Bill's poor respiratory condition became aggravated. A smoker, he had chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, including emphysema and chronic bronchitis. Paul and Marlene Lodge lived down the road from the Beckers on LeBaron Lane. When the couple heard on the radio of an order to evacuate their area, they called neighbors and set off an impromptu phone tree. At the foot of LeBaron Lane, a deputy told the Lodges they could not go west to enter I-90 via Petty Creek Bridge, so they switched to their truck to drive east on the muddy, rutted Southside Road. The smell of chlorine wasn't that strong to Paul up at his house, but it strengthened along the riverside. As they passed by the Riverview Ranch, Lodge stopped to view a herd of elk. I rolled down the window and just got hit in the face by it, he said, realizing for the first time how serious things were. The Lodges went straight to Missoula. No one mentioned decontamination. I know a lot of people were having difficulty with rashes the first couple of days, people who didn't change clothes, Marlene said. Dixie and Alan Robertson lived with their 2 children 2.5 miles east of Petty Creek on Southside Road. Dixie was woken by a coughing fit and heard the Alberton siren in the distance. As they evacuated toward Petty Creek, it smelled like a pesticide, not just chlorine, she said. The Robertsons suffered coughing and burning skin, and Dixie and her eldest son both went to the ER. Justin, an asthmatic, had trouble breathing. Dixie's cough persisted non-stop for days, a hacking sound shared by many people at the public meetings. We're all sitting here in the same clothes that we had on when we left here, Robertson said. So she went to MRL and told them she needed money for toothbrushes and night clothes. She recalled they hesitated, and it took a few days before clothes vouchers were generally offered. No one ever told the Robertsons to decontaminate. The people who went to Missoula, she said, you're on your own. Across the river from Southside lay Ponderosa Acres, a benchland subdivision in a bulbous bend of the Clark Fork River. Its lone access was Petty Creek, making the area a big dead end. The Garst family lived on Terrace View Drive. Kim Garst's sister, Tammy Mayo, was visiting from Florida, and together they had 3 children in the house. Garst and Mayo were roused by a phone call around 6 a.m. Garst said the air smelled like pesticides or chemical fire. Chlorine was just an afterbite. Garst worked at Stone Container, which had a bleach processing plant, and knew well the smell of chlorine. Mayo said, we could smell chemical odors that burned everyone's skin, eyes, and throats as they fled. Garst had difficulty breathing and vomited. Both families were in a panic of wailing children as they drove west toward the oncoming cloud to escape via I-90. Beverly and Marshall Ridenauer lived with their child on Meadow Lane. We didn't get evacuated from our home when the spill happened. We were left in there, 30-year-old Beverly said. Before 6 a.m., Brad and I went out to feed the dogs, and you could really smell the chlorine. And you could see the cloud. It was just a fog rolling in, back by the neighbors. We thought, oh, we're safe where we are. Assuming school would be closed in Alberton, Marshall stayed home with Brad while Beverly left for work around 9 a.m. Ridenauer exited via Petty Creek. As I got closer to the river, the smell got stronger, and I was driving through that fog. Once on the interstate, she said, the sicker I got. Hearing on the radio about the evacuation center at Frenchtown High School, she drove to the school because I was so sick. I was just nauseated. My head was starting to hurt. I started to get out of the car and almost collapsed, dizzy. When a paramedic told her the Ponderosa Acres subdivision had been evacuated, I just started to panic, she said, because I'm thinking my family is still there. Marshall soon self-evacuated his son and 2 house guests. Beverly heard that the smell was coming into the house with the doors and windows shut. It was so bad. Marshall and 1 house guest needed oxygen at Frenchtown. The Ponderosa 1 family lived near the river at the southernmost bulge of the subdivision. Note, throughout this book, people wishing to remain anonymous are referred to by their location and a number or color. You could smell the chlorine, Ponderosa 1 recalled. While her family evacuated, Ponderosa 1 debated what to do with a yearling colt. A deputy said, I could lead her cross country going continuously away from Petty Creek. Ponderosa 1 led the colt northeast until she cut a fence by Eddie's Underpass and entered the interstate. When I got to the 9-mile bridge, the cloud was already there. You could see it, you could smell it, she said. Cresting the 9-mile hill, she had to descend again. And at first, getting back down into it was difficult, she said, because the colt, of course, was really freaked out by the smell. But then within a few minutes, I was pretty numb. My nasal passages and my throat and everything. I was aware initially of the burning, but it didn't take very long before it was just numb. I wasn't really aware of the damage that was being done. She walked to Huson, over 5 miles from her home, and boarded her colt. I ended up developing just a really awful cough a couple days afterwards. I shed all the skin on the inside of my mouth and my tongue. It was really kind of gross. But it took a couple days before things really started happening. At Community Hospital, she received no decontamination, and the family wore their clothes for a couple days. Further north, Steve Adams and family lived about 6 miles from the spill near Eddie's Underpass, a dead-end spur off the frontage road near I-90. Adams' nearest neighbor was 53-year-old Dan Watts, vice president of MRL, a quarter-mile up road. A 32-year employee of Burlington Northern, Watts had joined MRL that year. Adams checked on Watts, but Watts had already hightailed it. Watts, naturally, heard about the spill well before Adams and evacuated with horses and pets. In contrast to neighbor helping neighbor stories, Adams said, we are the only other people that live on the road, and then Watts never called us or told us or nothing. Adams thought, I've got 2 small kids up there. You don't think to pick up the phone and call me? A volunteer fireman notified the family around 6 a.m. By then you could see the cloud coming along the river, he said. A green-tinted fog, almost treetop high. Telephone pole high, with tentacles blowing off. Adam's wife at the time, Lori, recalled the odor extremely strong, which smelled like there was more than just chlorine, though she couldn't identify it. By the time Steve got his family into the car, he said, I blistered my lips. I blistered my nose. About 1.5 miles northeast of the Petty Creek exit, Roscoe Road branched off from the frontage road opposite Eddie's Underpass, up the forested flank of Ellis Mountain. Stephen and Christine Edgar and their infant child lived about 2 miles up Roscoe Road, due north of and some 200 feet above Ponderosa Acres. A neighbor's phone call woke them at 5:20 a.m., and they smelled a strong chlorine odor inside their house. Outside, Stephen found a very thick gas cloud. Their German Shepherd dog lay on the ground, gasping for air. The Edgars described a 15-foot visibility within the gas cloud during their evacuation, which caused immediate gagging, coughing, breathing difficulty, and burning eyes. Catherine DeNute lived at the last house on Roscoe Road with 3 teenage boys. A neighbor from the bottom of the road called her around 5 a.m. and told her to leave immediately for Frenchtown High School. Outside, she said, I got a whiff of it and went, oh my God, we've got to go. We could smell it, and it was really strong. At that time, it was like a heavy chlorine smell. As they drove off, she said, it was just overwhelming. Our eyes were tearing up. I told everybody to keep your mouth shut, and she had her kids cover their faces with cloth. The gas cloud looked like a fog, she said, which thickened as they descended and only dissipated by the time they passed Houston. From these reports, the gas cloud was thick, almost 6 road miles from the spill and fairly high above the river. The deputies had no protection. At Frenchtown High School, Deputy Joe McNeil monitored the sheriff's radio. I'm hearing some of our guys are getting the gas. Unfortunately, I'm the one with the SCBA unit. I'm trying to let everybody know to stay up high, knowing that chlorine settles down low. Willis was already saying he was choking. His eyes were running or hurting, Sergeant Dave Ball recalled of Deputy Hintz. Captain Gerald Kriego told Hintz to get out, but Hintz refused. As members of the SWAT team, Hintz and Deputy Dave Walrod had a filter mask in their vehicles for chemical agents. Hintz didn't use his because he didn't think it would work with chlorine. He later learned it would have helped some. Shame on me, he said. But these masks were of short-term use and mainly for escape, not recommended in exposures beyond 5 parts per million. Hintz only noticed a chlorine smell. There was a couple of places where you hit little bowls, he said, where it settled in. It was really strong, and there was a little burning in the nose and stuff, but as soon as you went 10 feet, you was out of it. So when you was going into the low spots, you got the hell out of there quick. Hintz said he never saw anything that made me believe there was a big cloud circling me and I was about to die. And like I said, the rain really did help us out, and the high humidity keeping everything down and not moving. But not moving meant the gas was slow to disperse. Through his emergency training and observations, Hintz felt the deputies took calculated risks. But there were many unknowns. The amount of chlorine spilled and still leaking, how fast it was moving, what else had possibly spilled, and how it might affect a given person, especially over time. The deputies risked exposure for hours. Hintz monitored by symptoms, the deputies having no chlorine meters. But many deputies complained of burning irritation. They also risked becoming insensitive while damage continued, as Ponderosa 1 experienced with her Colt. Deputies in IC Waldron all reported strong gas smells in the area east of Petty Creek. While residents suffered acute symptoms and some went to hospitals, most had relatively short exposures compared to the deputies. Hintz: I was more concerned about the people in their houses and stuff and to get them out than to worry about me. But the issue was proper protection, and responders weren't supposed to make the situation worse by becoming victims. Additionally, more responders, protected, would have sped up evacuations for everyone. With Hintz and Van Wormer doing the brunt of the east evacuations, why not bring in more deputies with protection, including gear for Hintz and Van Wormer? Captain Kriego was deploying officers. Hintz had earlier asked 911 to page search and rescue personnel to get out here and start helping us notify people, he said, but he received no such help. Yet, Kriego was concerned with Hintz's long exposure. I was asked to leave, Hintz said. I didn't, and then I finished up the evacuation. The ultimate responsibility for the deputy's safety fell on IC Waldron, who was supposed to know the whereabouts and status of the crews at all times. The incident commander is responsible for the whole incident, period, Missoula Hazmat's Tom Ziegler said. But Waldron wasn't communicating with the sheriff's office. In sum, the few deputies had little protection, no monitors, and limited information about the spill. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we continue with Part 2 of Chapter 6, Gassed, and the evacuation of the immediate Alberton area from a massive chlorine cloud. Till then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.